So our next speaker is Adam Smith.
Okay, great. So thank you so much to all the organizers of this conference. This has been really, really great to be a part of, and I'm really thankful to have the time to be able to talk to all of you. For all of you that I haven't met, my name's Adam Smith, not the one that Katie Creedle quoted earlier today. I'm younger and less Scottish, and I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Utah. And my goal today is to really, again, because I have such little time, just sketch a number of approaches that people can pursue in the future under the heading Feminist Political Philosophy of Science. I'm going to briefly cover some of the current approaches to a political philosophy of science with a focus on the question of political legitimacy and science policy advising, which includes the advising process itself and the science used in the advising process. I'm then going to argue for a need to turn to feminist political philosophies to address the problem of marginalization in policymaking. And finally, again, I'm just going to sketch some connections between feminist political philosophy, feminist philosophy of science, and feminist epistemology to argue that we can combine these three fields of study to achieve several things that philosophers of science are concerned with, including objectivity, public trust in science, and political legitimacy. So this gives philosophers of science the tools to be forceful and convincing advocates for the greater inclusion of marginalized groups in both science and science policy advising. So feminist philosophers of science have, in my view, convincingly shown that non-epistemic values play an important role in science. And by non-epistemic values, I mean any sort of ethical, social, political, religious, or cultural values. And while the growing acceptance of the role of non-epistemic values in science has occurred, several problems have arisen. One problem centers on science policy advising and the use of non-epistemic values in that process. The worry is that science advisors, using their own personal non-epistemic values, bypass the normal democratic procedures, causing the policies that scientists are advising on to be less politically legitimate. There have been several responses to this, with one leading response being that science policy advisors, and maybe even all scientists in all contexts, should be using the public's non-epistemic values when making value decisions, because in a liberal democracy at least, the public should either directly or indirectly have a say in policy decisions. Accounts taking this approach have been labeled democratic values accounts by Swazig Libian. Apologies for pronunciation. These accounts can be differentiated by how we are supposed to include the public and the public's non-epistemic values in science policy advising, or even all of science. So some democratic values accounts call for science shops, consensus conferences, community advisory boards, and citizen planning efforts. Others engage more directly with political philosophy and endorse a deliberative democracy account of political legitimacy. Deliberative democracy holds that policies achieve political legitimacy from actual, specifically structured deliberations. Deliberative polling, in particular, has been discussed by philosophers of science as a method for identifying the values that can appropriately influence science and science policy advising, where appropriate in this case means contributing to politically legitimate public policies. So deliberative polling is a process where a small group representative of the social groups that are going to be affected by the policy in question is gathered and then educated by experts before discussing a specific policy. The education part of the deliberative process is crucial because what many deliberative Democrats want is not just the opinions of the public, but the informed opinions of the public. So arguing for certain non-epistemic values and value trade-offs as they relate to a potential policy is not really worth much if one doesn't know how those values or value trade-offs are going to impact the potential policy. After some education, the group's discussion is guided by a moderator in order to uphold certain ideals, including equality, reciprocity, absence of coercion, and fairness. And the more that the actual discussions live up to these criteria, the more they contribute to political legitimacy. Ideally, the group can reach a consensus, but if not, the group could reach a compromise, they could hold a majority vote, they could propose that multiple approaches be taken at the same time, or some other mechanism could be decided upon to come to some sort of final decision. Now, one major problem for democratic values accounts is the problem of marginalization. Recently, Swazig Libian and Christina Rowland have both objected to deliberative democratic methods on the grounds that they fail to prevent the marginalization of non-epistemic values and knowledge of historically oppressed groups, Levian is concerned with public trust and Roland with objectivity. But marginalization is also a major problem for political legitimacy in liberal democracies because inequality goes against the core values of liberal democracy. Marginalization can occur through outright dismissal or exclusion of certain groups' values, or through the lack of inclusion due to the lack of awareness of certain viewpoints and or the inability of those viewpoints to become known by the broader public. And sadly, science has a long, long history of being infused with false, prejudiced values, thereby failing to represent, oppressing, and or abusing various marginalized groups. And democratic governments are no different in that regard. That said, I think that democratic values accounts can respond if they adopt explicitly feminist political philosophies. And this is really needed because for my searching, I could only find a few examples I have up there of applying feminist political philosophy to questions about values in science. If people know of others, please let me know. I want to read all of that. I can only be doing so much searching, so I'd love to talk to you if you know more. So to address the problems of marginalization, the ideals of deliberation for deliberative democracy, again, equality, reciprocity, absence of coercion, and fairness, need to be specified in the philosophy of science literature in such a way that, if realized, they would prevent marginalization. There also needs to be specific suggestions for how to ensure that these specified ideals are to be upheld in practice. So you can say that we have equality in deliberations, everyone has an equal chance to participate in the deliberation, but unless people are actually feeling comfortable that they can share their own non-epistemic values in that deliberation and actually do take equal part in those deliberations, then equality really hasn't been achieved. So we need some ways to ensure that this happens in practice and not just sort of a formal level of equality. Luckily, there already exists feminist scholarship on deliberative democracy, much of which is under the label politics of recognition. The politics of recognition calls for, among other things, the special representation of marginalized groups in some sense. Each will have a different idea of what that special representation means. But I also want to take this opportunity to point out that there is another major account of political legitimacy that has yet to be explored much in great detail by philosophers of science, and that's public reason. Public reason holds that public policies are politically legitimate if they are based on reasons, which includes non-epistemic values, that are in some sense justifiable to all reasonable people, which I know is a lovely general phrase, and different public reason accounts will specify what that means. And again, luckily for me, there is already a feminist account of public reason developed by Laurie Watson and Christy Hartley. So it holds that everyone must follow the criterion of reciprocity, which comes from Rawls, which requires citizens to offer reasons to others that they sincerely believe others will accept as reasonable and as consistent with their equal standing as free and equal citizens. What makes Watson and Hartley's account unique is that they argue that to achieve this goal, to adhere to the criterion of reciprocity, two things are needed. First, the eradication of social conditions of domination and subordination relevant to democratic deliberation among free and equal citizens. And two, the provision of the social conditions of recognition respect, which are the social conditions necessary for individuals to advance fundamental principles of justice under conditions which they believe it is reasonable for them to accept as free and equal citizens. And they get the concept of recognition respect from Stephen Darwall. So when we apply this to science policy advising, I think we can say that feminist public reason requires science advising processes to eradicate any social conditions of domination and subordination and provide the social conditions necessary for individuals, meaning the science advisors, the public, or both, to advance their own non-epistemic values. And of course, these are goals for society at large. Science policy advising cannot be expected to solve these problems on their own, but they need to do what they can in their own space to achieve these goals. Importantly, non-epistemic values, or any non-epistemic values that meet the criterion of reciprocity can be used. This makes it possible for science policy advisors to make value decisions on their own and still contribute to politically legitimate policies, which may or may not be attractive to you, depending on the extent to which you think the expertise of the scientists allows them to better know how different values and value trade-offs will affect the science itself. Lastly, I want to point out that deliberative democracy comes from public reason, and though they are different, they can be combined in interesting ways to try and get the best of both accounts. Now, the ideals that I've talked about so far of politics of recognition and feminist political philosophy, or feminist public reason, they might sound great. I hope they sound great. But you're probably asking, how are we supposed to actually put this into practice and make sure that they get realized? And here I suggest that we can extend the decades of work done by feminist philosophers of science and feminist epistemologists to the role of science and science policy advising, contributing to politically legitimate policies. Okay, so for example, it has been shown in primatology, research on human behavior, and archaeology that a greater number of perspectives, backgrounds, values, so forth, allow for both a wider range of ideas to be proposed and for assumptions made by dominant groups to be challenged by other groups, resulting in more empirically successful science. Jonna A.G. Watkin has an excellent paper highlighting the similarities as well as differences between this literature, specifically Helen Longino's Critical Contextual Empiricism and Deliberative Democracy. And because those connections are already explored, I encourage you to read that paper if you're interested in this. I want to briefly point out in the rest of the talk similarities between feminist public reason and both Longino's Critical Contextual Empiricism and Sandra Harding's Feminist Standpoint Theory, Strong Objectivity. So first, for evidence, methods, assumptions, and values to be criticized, there must be recognized avenues of criticism. Science policy advising committees can and should be a recognized avenue of criticism. The discussions and decisions of the committee should be made public, and there should be an opportunity for other scientists, as well as the public, to comment on the proceedings and the tentative advice of the committee before it is finalized. And this is already true of some science advisory committees, such as the independent expert committees for the Federal Drug Administration or the FDA. Second and third, the scientific community must have shared standards according to which they can judge both the research and the criticisms. And when a particular research, aim, methodology, or result receives legitimate criticism based on shared standards, the community has to respond in some way. So, where's the connection? Feminist public reason provides a normative standard for criticism, the criterion of reciprocity, and science advisors can be criticized for not following this criterion. Fourth and finally, there must be a tempered equality of intellectual authority, according to which all views and critiques are treated equally, at least in the beginning. According to Longino in her 2002 book, consensus cannot be reached by, quote, the exercise of political or economic power or the exclusion of dissenting perspectives, but as a result of critical dialogue in which all relevant perspectives are represented. This aligns with the principle of non-domination, which forbids the exclusion or domination of marginalized and oppressed groups. Additionally, again from Longino 2002, communities must take, quote, take active steps to ensure that alternative viewpoints are developed enough to be a source of criticism and new perspectives. And this helps provide the social conditions necessary for recognition and respect. Feminist standpoint theory is also helpful in preventing marginalization in science policy advising, helping to achieve politically legitimate policies. Harding's version of feminist standpoint theory, strong objectivity, is a kind of social objectivity that calls for not just value diversity in general, but specifically the, quote, missing perspectives. It forbids certain values, such as racist and sexist values, from being used from the start because they are known to hurt epistemic success. It calls for us to, when relevant, start from outside perspectives because this is what, quote, enables the detection of the dominant values, interests, and assumptions that may or may not be widely prevalent, but which tend to serve primarily the most powerful social groups, end quote. And that's from her 2015 book. These requirements provide further guidance on how to realize the principle of non-domination and provide the social conditions necessary for recognition and respect. And of course, I want to mention that this work from feminist philosophy of science and feminist epistemology has to be extended to all marginalized groups, not just women, and needs to be done in an intersectional way. So, when these different areas are combined, we get what I want to call a feminist political philosophy of science that, depending on the combination of theories you select, and as I've hoped to show, there's many, many different combinations you could pick, these different combinations provide, one, good epistemic and normative reasons to exclude prejudiced values from the scientific process and science policy advising, and two, gives concrete rules or norms for scientific communities and science policy advisors to follow to help contribute to politically legitimate policies. And to the extent that preventing marginalization improves objectivity and public trust in science, we get those as well. So in summary, a feminist political philosophy of science gives us philosophers of science the epistemic and normative resources to forcefully argue for significant changes to science and science policy advising to help address the long history, which largely continues today, of many communities being marginalized and left out of the scientific and policymaking processes, resulting in worse science and, at best, unequal policies. Some examples of where this work can be applied are better inclusion of racial and ethnic minorities in the development of public health policies, and better inclusion of indigenous peoples in fire management policies, but the list is much, much longer than that. So as Harding nicely summarizes in a 1993 article, the considerations laid out in this talk, quote, requires that scientists and their communities be integrated into democracy-advancing projects for scientific and epistemological reasons, as well as moral and political ones. Thank you.
So this is really cool and exciting. One question that I have are criticisms of sort of deliberative democracy frameworks and public reason frameworks from feminist political philosophers. So thinking about ways in which looking at public reason might exclude certain forms of speech or protest or something like that because it's not clearly reason giving within these deliberative processes or something like that. So I wonder what you think about some of those criticisms from like Iris Young and so on about public reason.
Yeah, there's definitely a tension between the way that public reason is sometimes construed as the reason, to be a public reason, it has to be available to everyone. And if you adopt some sort of standpoint theory, then that sort of by definition makes some reasons less accessible to others. And those seem to be in direct conflict, so how do those come together? I think it's entirely possible that the two could be brought closer together. And one of the papers I cited about public reason was a forthcoming paper by Katie Creedle and Zena Ward, and they use this accessibility requirement where you don't actually necessarily, for something to count as a public reason, it doesn't necessarily have to be something that you yourself fully understand and experience, but instead you could affirm or adopt some sort of process that gives you knowledge. And so you could sort of look at something like standpoint theory and say, look, I'm not going to have the kind of experiences or situated knowledge of every group because that's just impossible, but I accept the framework and the methodology of that theory, and so I count as reliable whatever is produced by that methodology. And that it makes those accessible to me in kind of an indirect way. And so that would count as a public reason. And so I think that's one way to go.
We have time for one more question.
Thank you for that tour de force tour.
It was a lot, yeah,
It was
sorry.
a lot.
It was,
So I want to ask about something kind of nitty-gritty in the deliberative democracy space. The deliberative democracy people that I know who work on deliberative forum really emphasize the importance of really good facilitators for precisely the reason of leveling whatever sort of power hierarchies exist outside the deliberative space. When the folks, oh shoot, I forgot who it was because there was too much, talk about, like removing the social and political marginalization. Obviously, we can't do that for society as a whole before doing deliberative democracy. Do they mean just in the space, and do they talk about how to create the kind of facilitation in these events that makes that possible?
yes, so I believe you're referring to Watson and Hartley? Yes, okay. So they are concerned specifically with any kind of public discourse. So any time you have members of the public getting together and discussing reasons in favor or against a policy, those are situations where those two principles need to be achieved. As to how to achieve them, I think they're currently working on that. This book is from a few years ago, and they have some work after that. And that's where I bring in the Longino's work, Harding's work, or if you prefer some other version of feminist empiricism or standpoint, that's cool too. And the idea would be to have moderators adopt these kinds of norms from philosophy of science to try and achieve or to try and achieve a more level playing field. But I know there's also some really good work done by political scientists, political theorists on the sort of nitty-gritty of this that I haven't looked into. So I think that's why I haven't fully answered your question, but thank you.
Let's thank Adam again.